New stuff for today. If we look at our schedule of events, we should be getting into the skeletal system. So I'll start by introducing the components to the skeletal system. It'll take us a couple of days. Well, I'll say this. We have only 2 days to get through it. It probably would take more than that, but we're going to try and squeeze it into 2 days. So I'm going to see how far I can get through this stuff today. I'm hoping that we can at least get through the skeletal tissues review and half of the skeletal system handout. I'm hoping we can get through axial skeleton and I can introduce that from the lab list. I'm sure we won't get all the way through and we'll have to leave the appendicular skeleton and some of the joints and body movements for Tuesday. There is a couple of other reminders. Quiz 4, which is all about the skeletal system that we're introducing today, that's currently available on D2L. It showed up, I think, yesterday. But it doesn't go away until Tuesday at midnight. So you've got the weekend, you've got some time to finish skeletal system. We've got to finish talking about it. We haven't even started that yet. But the other, maybe more important deadline is the third quiz that's all about the integument stuff we talked about last time. Goes away at midnight tonight. I think most people have taken that already, but I just wanted to mention it in case you didn't get a chance to take it. Be sure to take quiz 3 because it will go away. After that deadline is when I will click a button to make it reveal the answers to the questions. Right now you can take it and it'll just tell you how many points you got right. If you got all 15 points or if you missed a few, and then you can take it multiple times. It'll always keep the highest score, but you want to take it at least once to get a score. Any questions about our to-do list at all? It's crazy to think that just a week from today we'll be taking our second exam, which is all about the skeletal system and the integument stuff. So if there are questions about anything, throw it out there. We've got our our Unit 2 lab list that we skimmed the surface of last time, and we'll try and get most of the way through today. But that's it for my introduction. Everybody ready to jump into this? All right. Well, stop me if there's questions about anything. I think before I start clicking through these slides, let's list over here the components to the skeletal system. It'll take us, like I said, a couple of days to get through, but I bet we can get through cartilage and most of the bones today. There's 4 components to the skeletal system, and we've introduced cartilage before. We know that there's 3 types of cartilage. Just list them here: hyaline cartilage, elastic cartilage, and fibrocartilage. We introduced types of bone, and we're going to look at 2 different types of bone tissue. We'll look at compact bone and spongy bone. And then I'm sure this will be next time, but we're going to get into ligaments and joints. We can define ligaments as a bone-to-bone connection. As opposed to a tendon that would be a muscle-to-bone connection. A bone-to-bone connection is just a ligament. Then joints are going to be just places where 2 bones meet. All right. And you know, we already have gone through the tissues part, so we've seen these different types of cartilage, so the first few slides might be something of a review. Let's jump into this. We had seen this slide before, and what I liked about it is that it introduced the 3 types of cartilage that we have to be familiar with. And you might remember from last time that hyaline cartilage was the most common, the most widespread type of cartilage. You see it here in kind of the blue color. We will draw it at the ends of these long bones, places where bones meet. The ends of those bones are covered in hyaline cartilage. We'll refer to that as this articular cartilage that just helps prevent those bones from grinding together and wearing down. You also see this hyaline cartilage that makes up the connections between the sternum and the ribs that we'll talk about. So all of this stuff is going to be hyaline cartilage. The bridge of your nose is also composed of hyaline cartilage. We'll even see by the end of this, when we start to talk about how bones formed, most of the bones in the body started out as cartilage and then became ossified or calcified into bone tissue. So anyway, hyaline cartilage, the most common. We've seen that. The least common type of cartilage is this elastic cartilage. The only 2 places we can really point to are in the earlobe, so we can see a little bit of it in the earlobe. And then the other place that you can't really see, except for this part of the model, the epiglottis has a hinge made out of elastic cartilage, and that's what allows it to kind of move around. So least common type of cartilage. And then we said fibrocartilage was intermediate in terms of how common it is, but it's the strongest cartilage by far because it has all of those collagen fibers. And you see it in places of the body that have to support a lot of weight or compression. So the intervertebral discs, you can barely tell. Those are red, indicating the presence of fibrocartilage. You also see it in the pubic symphysis, where those two coxal bones come together. And then the meniscus, these additional pads of the knee, because that's a joint that has to support a lot of the body weight. I'm just looking randomly over here for examples of that cartilage. I showed you the rib cage for examples of hyaline cartilage, the ear for examples of elastic cartilage. So anywhere in between these vertebrae, we can see the little discs that represent fibrocartilage. Or we can grab, or you can see them both on here, the fibrocartilage in between those intervertebral discs, and then we can also see the pubic symphysis that represents places we can find fibrocartilage. I think your lecture handout wants you to know some places where you can find each of those types of cartilage. So that might be helpful in answering those out. Here are some things that all the different types of cartilage has in common, whether you're talking about hyaline cartilage, elastic cartilage, or fibrocartilage. Cartilage is going to be mostly water, between 60 to 80% water. And then the other part of it is going to be collagen fibers. It doesn't have any direct blood supply, and it doesn't have any direct nerve supply. That means if you damage cartilage, it's hard to tell because there's not like a nerve that has been damaged that you feel that you've done damage to the cartilage. And there's no blood supply. Being avascular, that means if you damage cartilage, it takes much longer to heal compared to bone tissue. I'm going to grab one of these bone models. And you can see bone tissue does have a bunch of blood vessels that run through it. If you have broken a bone, you know that it heals in a matter of weeks. And sometimes after it heals, it can be as strong, or if not stronger, than when it was broken, because there's a bunch of osteoblasts that lay down new bone tissue and can seal together broken pieces of bone. We don't have those blood vessels in cartilage, so if you damage cartilage, it takes much longer to repair itself and is often not as strong as it was before it was damaged. So again, that's due to the fact that cartilage doesn't have any direct blood supply, so the nutrients can't be delivered and the waste can't be washed away as fast. And since it's not innervated, you often can't tell if you've damaged cartilage. The other thing that you can notice on the outside of this example of a piece of cartilage is a little layer of dense irregular connective tissue on the outer parts of this cartilage. And the term that describes the outer perimeter of cartilage is perichondrium. The first part, peri, always tells us around, and then chondrium tells us what it's around. So perichondrium just means around cartilage, and it's referring to that dense irregular connective tissue. That perichondrium is going to be important if we think about one of the ways in which cartilage grows. I think we are getting to the part on the lecture list where we need to know the types of cartilaginous growth. There's two methods. And I guess my head is a little bit ahead of where we are with the slides. The next few slides just remind us of those pictures of hyaline cartilage. It looked something like this, where you had those chondrocytes inside their little lacuna. And in between those chondrocytes, we just see this blank, empty matrix. So we said costal cartilage, this thing that I keep holding up, the cartilage of the ribs, the articular cartilage that we're going to draw on the ends of long bones. I mentioned that the embryonic skeleton, most of those bones are made out of hyaline cartilage. They're going to get replaced with bony tissue. And even the respiratory cartilages, if you put your hand on the anterior part of your throat and rub up and down, you can feel those ridges. That's hyaline cartilage ridges in the trachea. I don't know if we've gotten to tracheal models yet, but each of these little rings of cartilage is also this hyaline cartilage. Elastic cartilage, we said you can notice that because Once again, we see chondrocytes inside the lacuna, but this time, if we look at that matrix, it's not empty. It has these elastic fibers that run through it. So abundant elastic fibers in elastic cartilage. And then there were abundant collagen fibers in fibrocartilage. We can still see these chondrocytes in that little space, in this little lacuna, but in between those cells, this extracellular matrix has abundant collagen fibers. And it's really those collagen fibers that give this particular cartilage that strength to withstand compression. So we said intervertebral discs, the meniscus of the knee, pubic symphysis, all places where we find this fibrocartilage.
Which cartilage is able to withstand large amounts of compression?
This one, this fibrocartilage, and it's due to the fact that this is the only type of cartilage that has abundant collagen fibers. Because elastic cartilage has those elastic fibers and hyaline cartilage doesn't have any fibers. No problem. Now to that part where we're thinking about the two ways in which cartilage grows. There is one way in which you get new cartilage cells. A cartilage cell, instead of me just saying the cartilage cell, we can say chondrocyte, because anytime we hear chondro, we're thinking cartilage, and when we hear cyte, we're thinking just a mature cell that maintains whatever tissue is present. So if we're talking about cartilage, it's a chondrocyte. If we're talking about bones, it's an osteocyte. There's a chondrocyte. So in this slide, we're thinking of what are the new ways in which we get chondrocytes. And the first type of cartilage growth that we see is called oppositional growth. You can describe this type of growth as getting new cartilage cells from the outside of cartilage. So this is growth from the outside, and it starts by those cells on the perimeter, those perichondrium cells. That was dense irregular connective tissue. And those cells change into chondrocytes. It's kind of worth when we went back and we were talking about connective tissue last time, we said all connective tissue was derived from those mesenchyme cells. And those had committed to becoming a type of connective tissue, but we didn't know what type of connective tissue yet. And here's an example where one of those mesenchyme cells started to build dense irregular connective tissue. So it started to become connective tissue proper. And then at some stage we'll see that those cells of the perichondrium can be stimulated to convert into supportive connective tissue. In case these chondrocytes. So oppositional growth we can see is growth from the outside. You get new cartilage cells from that perimeter of perichondrium. Then the other way that you get new cartilage cells is by chondrocytes that were already within the middle of that piece of cartilage just dividing by mitosis. So here's a chondrocyte in the middle of a piece of cartilage, and it just goes through a stage of mitosis and yields two of these new cartilage cells. So growth from the middle of that piece of cartilage is just called interstitial growth, growth from within. Now we get into bones. Did everybody get all the questions in there about cartilage? I think there's some. Sure.
It's on the other slide that you were just on. I don't know if it matters, but so on the oppositional growth, it says chondroblasts, and then on the interstitial growth, it says chondrocytes, and I know the word blast and cytes mean something different. So does that matter? Or
Well, so what that is describing is the fact that this is a cell that has built a cartilage cell. It wasn't previously a cartilage cell, and it's building new cartilage cells, where these were already a cartilage cell, and they're just dividing through mitosis. No problem. Good catch. These are the handouts for today. You may have already printed these out, but if not, did you get a Unit 2 lab list?
I don't think so.
You got a Unit 2 lab list, right? Mm-hmm. All right. We're only like 3 or 4 slides deep into that through the the cartilage stuff. If y'all need me to go back at any point, I'll be glad to do that whenever we get into the lab stuff. And then the other notable things, the lecture that we had last time about the integument system is currently up on D2L. So if you need a refresher or if you didn't get to see it, it's there. And we're recording this one, so this one should show up on Tuesday. All right, if you got that lecture handout, I think we just got through the first 4 questions, and we're about to get to number 5. Name those 7 functions of the bone. So we switch to this picture where we're thinking now about those bones of the skeleton rather than the cartilage. And we're going to take a couple of days to get all the way through the skeleton. We're going to hopefully get through the axial skeleton today, which you can see is going to be the skull, the vertebral column, and the rib cage. We're going to leave the appendages, this appendicular skeleton, for next time. So the arms as well as the scapula and this collarbone that attach the upper, I guess I got an email, that attach this upper extremity to the rest of the body. Then you've got your lower appendages attached by this coxal bone. So those hip bones are also going to be part of this appendicular skeleton that we'll mention next Tuesday. But I'm hoping that we can get all the way through at least the axial skeleton today. Before we look at the different parts of the skeleton, we'll start by introducing just some functions that bones have collectively. And the first few are obvious. The first function that we can list for bones is support. So I am able to fight gravity from pulling me to the floor because I've got bones and a skeletal system to stand up. In addition to support, you've got bones that provide protection for those delicate organs like the brain, the spinal cord, heart, the lungs. I ran under a tree the other day and I didn't even see it, but there was a branch that stabbed me in the skull, and I was thinking, man, I'm glad I have this skull, because it would have just poked right into my brain. So bones are there for protection. The third thing we can kind of give as a function to bones, you can kind of put this as an indirect function, but we have to say that bones function in movement because they act as these levers for muscles to pull on. You're able to write notes because your muscles are able to pull on those bones in a way to pull the pencil or pen around to write notes on the board. I'd just be a pile of muscles twitching up here on the floor if I didn't have bones for those muscles to pull on. So that's 3. The fourth one is going to be storage, and mostly it's going to be storage of things like calcium phosphates. We had mentioned in our introduction to homeostasis last time that many things have to be kept within a tolerable range for us to stay alive, like body temperature, the pH of the blood, the glucose levels of the blood, and even the calcium levels of the blood. And one of the things the bone is going to function in is storing excess calcium when there's too much of it in the bloodstream. There are cells that will grab that excess calcium and build bone with it real quick so that it's not in the bloodstream. But conversely, if there's not enough calcium in the bloodstream, there are other cells that can dissolve bone tissue to make sure there's sufficient amounts of calcium in the bloodstream. Neurons can't send signals. The heart can't pump if there's not sufficient amounts of calcium. So it's important for the bones to be able to release calcium or store calcium when there's excess or a deficit. The fifth function is going to be blood cell formation. Maybe put a little side note next to this that whenever we find red bone marrow, whenever you see red bone marrow, this is a site of blood cell formation. What we call hematopoiesis, blood cell formation. Red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets all are being formed in red bone marrow. The sixth function is another storage, but instead of storing calcium phosphate, the sixth function in terms of storage is going to be storing triglycerides. This, if you want to put a little side note next to this, this is yellow bone marrow. The only model that I have that really shows this is kind of this model. We're going to draw parts of this. This is part of a long bone, and if you break the shaft of a long bone, there is a hollow chamber called a medullary cavity. And in that medullary cavity is where you're going to find yellow bone marrow. Yellow bone marrow is almost entirely made out of triglycerides. It's a long-term energy molecule. So energy storage is synonymous with yellow bone marrow. And then our seventh and final function is hormone production. We're going to see some of these cells in bone are capable of producing hormones. One example is osteoclastin. We're going to look at other hormones in the second half of this semester. Endocrine system is chapter 16. But just to introduce, we're going to see hormones produced in different body tissues. And one of the hormones produced by bone tissue is called osteoclastin, and it's going to help regulate insulin secretion. Did you grab these? Got them already? Did anybody not get these? Okay, did you get these? Okay, cool. Okay, then I'm flipping the page and looks like we're going to move on to how we name these different types of bones. And there's 4 major classifications of bones if we're going to name them by their shape. And it's a pretty crude way of naming these bones. If a bone is taller than it is wide, it's considered a long bone. So this would obviously fit as a long bone. But even some of these bones in the hand, I would agree that these bones are relatively short, but even those bones there, those metacarpals covered up by the palm of the hand, those would be considered long bones because they are longer than they are wide. If we're going to try and find short bones, we really need to find these wrist bones, these carpal bones, is one example of a short bone. Another common example of one of these short bones is the patella bone, this kneecap bone. So short bones like this kneecap bone is about as tall as it is wide. So long bones and short bones. Another classification is flat bones. If you grab this scapula, you'll see if I turn it on the side like this, it's razor thin. And other bones are flat bones. If you come over here and grab some of these skull bones like this parietal bone, you'll see that it is also a very flat bone. Maybe not obvious, but if you come over here and grab these rib bones, they feel like a butter knife. They're flat bones. What else do we have over here? Just thinking of flat bones to grab. If it doesn't fit into that category of long, short, or flat bone, the sternum, here's another example of a flat bone. If it doesn't fit into long, short, or flat, then the other catch-all category for bone shapes is irregular shapes. So the vertebrae are examples of irregularly shaped bones. This sacrum is an example of an irregularly shaped bone. Even when we get into some of these skull bones, like the sphenoid bone, we'll see that it's a highly irregularly shaped bone. So if it doesn't fit into the category of long, short, or flat, we're going to lump it into this category of irregularly shaped. So 4 classifications if we're naming bones based on their shape. But there's another way that we can classify bones. What about this bone? And I know on a 2-dimensional surface that might not be obvious, but if you grab this thing in your hand, you'll see that it's got a bunch of projections on it. We're going to consider this thing an irregularly shaped bone. What about these here? The red one, that's a phalange or a digit. What? So I would agree that that's a relatively short bone, but it's twice as long as it is wide. So this would classify as a long bone versus the bones in the wrist. These carpal bones are, those are the short bones. They're about as tall as they are wide. I don't know if anybody noticed this is an individual with polydactyly. Additional 6th digit right there. What? All right. So 4 bones named off of their shape, long, short, flat, irregular. But then we have 2 bone naming mechanisms that are really naming the bone based off of its location rather than its shape. This is the patella bone. We classified it as a short bone if we're going to classify it by its shape, but if we're going to classify it by its location, it's described as a sesamoid bone. Sesamoid bones are bones that will form within tendons or ligaments. So a common sesamoid bone is this patella. If you look at the knee models here, you can see that this is a bone that has formed within a ligament or a tendon. Sometimes described as floating bones or sesamoid bone. Patella is one example. The hyoid bone is another example. This is the bone that we'll see right here in the anterior part of the neck. It serves as a place for the muscles of the tongue to attach to. So if you put your hand on the anterior part of your throat and move your tongue around, you'll feel that hyoid bone moving around. These are sesamoid bones or floating bones. They form within, like I said, ligaments or tendons. Even some like major league pitchers that use their throwing arm a lot, they could have these additional calcium deposits in ligaments and tendons, and those are additional bones that are forming. Okay, so sesamoid bones, another bone based off of its location is a sutural bone, and these are additional bones that will form between the sutures of the skull. It turns out that the sutures of the skull can be somewhat irregular, and this is probably more true the further back into the past that you go. If you notice, this is a picture of a skull from 1909, and the methods of delivering a child or the birth process was a little bit more crude, where there were actually these metal forceps that they would use to grab onto the newborn's head and help pull it out, which actually caused a lot of those skull bones to form irregular shapes. And so you'll see these additional sutural bones that will form between the suture lines of the skull. These, like this, you can see additional, there's 1, 2, 3, there's a fourth one over there, even a fifth one down here, these additional sutural bones. Sometimes just referred to as Wormian bones, named after the individual that first named these.
So the sesamoid, that only happens in your knee, and this only happens in your skull?
No, sesamoid bones just happen in ligaments or tendons.
Okay.
So I mentioned like those major league pitchers that throw a lot. Sometimes they get these calcium deposits. Those are additional bones that are forming in those ligaments and tendons. Those would be additional sesamoid bones. The hyoid bone is an example of another sesamoid bone. So there's multiple places in the body where we find these sesamoid bones, just again the ones that form within tendons. Wormian bones are just located in between those sutures of the skull due to the fact that there could be variations in how those sutures come together. And like we'll list when we get to the bones of the skeleton, which I'm sure is a slide that's coming up, we'll see that there are 206 bones in the body. But in the slide it says 206 plus, because even though everybody has 206 bones in their skeleton, some people have more than that 206 number. And ways that you can get more than the 206 normal bones is by having additional sutural bones, because you're a major league pitcher that uses your throwing arm a lot. Or you have had some irregular sutural bones that have formed. So this individual has 5 additional bones that other people don't have due to those additional Wormian bones or additional sutural bones. Checking our list, we've named 4 shapes of bones and 2 locations of bones. So the next thing on the list is to draw one of these long bones. And as we do this, we're going to start to talk about some of these bone markings that we're going to put on there. And here is a picture that I grabbed from some page in the textbook. This would be somewhere in chapter 6. But there is a diagram that will point out different vocabulary terms. These, not all of them, but most of these are going to be terms that you're going to find on your lab list. And if everybody has that lab list, if you'll just look at that real quick with me, I want to explain how I've tried to make this helpful to you. There's a lot of bones, and there's even some of these bone markings that we have to know. But here's, if you flip to the second page of our lab sheet, I'm looking at underneath lab 5 where it says axial skeleton. You can see that it says frontal bone, and then you've got 3 things underneath that frontal bone that we need to be able to recognize. And then you can see number 2 is the parietal bone. There's nothing on the parietal bone that we have to know. We just have to recognize that we're looking at a parietal bone. The third one there is the temporal bone. So we have to recognize that we're looking at a temporal bone, but then there are all of those things that we need to see on the temporal bone. As you scan through that, you can see I tried to put the bone name, and then indented underneath the bone name, I tried to put the certain bone markings that you might need to see on that particular bone. Does everybody find that? Now here's the other key that might be helpful to know. Whenever I go to make the practical, what I've also done is I've tried to put in order of importance. So you'll have to know the temporal bone, and then you'll need to know some of the things on that temporal bone, and I've put them in order of importance. So as long as you know the first 3 or 4 things underneath the names of those bones, that's going to catch likely anything I'm going to put on the practical. Some of them are long, like the temporal bone and the sphenoid bone, the mandible, the ethmoid bone. There are some of them that have many parts. And just between you and I and the camera that's filming there in the back, I'm going to start at the top of that list. And I'm sure not everything is going to get pinned on the practical, but you'll have to know the name of the bone. That's always going to be one of the questions. And then I'll probably mark 1 or 2 of those surface markings on each of those bones. Okay, and some of the surface markings, like I said, bring us to this slide. We'll see things like process. There's a lot of like a mandibular process on there, and a process is just a bone marking where there's a little projection or a bump that sticks out. A lot of these processes are going to be places for muscles or tendons to attach to. We'll see a sinus. There are, I think, 4 sinuses that we have to recognize, and we're going to see that a sinus is just a hollow chamber within the bone. I'm looking around because I think I can grab one of these large half-head models to show a couple of these sinuses that we'll have to see. This frontal sinus, it's a little hollow chamber inside the frontal bone, and there's a sphenoid sinus, this hollow chamber inside the sphenoid bone. So sinuses are hollow chambers. We're going to see several foramen. I don't know if you can make out that tiny term, foramen. This is going to be a round passageway through a bone, typically where nerves or blood vessels are going to go through. Down here we're looking at the femur. There are these larger projections on the femur that we're going to refer to as trochanters. There's a greater and a lesser trochanter. These are just bumps. And the humerus. This is the arm bone. There are bumps on the humerus as well, which again are places where muscles and tendons attach. The bumps on this humerus bone we're going to call tubercles. So tubercle, trochanter, these are just names of certain bone markings. And I tried to put where, which bone that marking is found on. So you'll find greater and lesser trochanter underneath the femur section of this lab, and you'll find greater and lesser tubercle underneath the humerus part of this lab. Those are appendages that we will talk about on Tuesday. I just wanted to point out some of these common terms that we'll use when we're describing bone surfaces. And before I get away from the slide, there's one more that I want to point out down here, this term called a condyle. We're going to see this a lot, and a condyle is going to be a part of the bone that is smooth. You see how it has this little smooth surface? Condyles are going to be modified parts of the bone where 2 bones are going to move against one another. Going to grab this femur that I was just referring to, these smooth parts on the femur are going to be what we call the condyle. We're going to have to tell which one is the lateral condyle and which one is the medial condyle. But first I just want to recognize condyles are these smooth articular surfaces on bones. The clue that tells us this is the medial condyle is because the head of the femur is always going to tell you the medial side. So that would have to be the lateral condyle. And I want to point that out because I'm just going to grab this humerus bone, comparing this humerus bone to the femur. Now we're moving up here into the arm, and you'll notice in the elbow region there are also these smooth articular surfaces, and those too are also condyles. But if you look closely at these condyles, these smooth surfaces, one of them has taken on kind of a rounded shape. And I'm going to have to grab my pointer because I can't reach up there. If we look at the distal end of this humerus, we'll see that right there is this smooth surface, this condyle. And this particular condyle has one part of it that is taken on kind of a rounded appearance, and it gets called the capitulum, which I know is not even a term that's on here yet. It should be on your lab list. And the other condyle is a trough-looking condyle that we call the trochlea. So trochlea and capitulum, I know those are not on that term, or on this board, those are modified condyles. So I'll describe the capitulum and the trochlea as modified condyles. Just know that a condyle is a smooth articular surface on a bone. Okay, I kind of ran into some bone surface markings and terms that we wanted to introduce real quick. And we also got to see kind of how this lab list works. But I'm going to go back to lecture stuff and thinking about bone tissue. And where we're going is I'm about to have to erase this skeletal system components list, and we're going to try and sketch out parts of a long bone. You've already got this sketch on the handout. You'll just have to label it. One of the things we're going to sketch here is I'm going to try and sketch the difference between compact bone and spongy bone. And in this slide we can see those what look like tree rings. That was the clue that we looked at when we were going through tissues last time to tell us that we're looking at compact bone. Compact bone looks kind of like these tree rings with these repeating circles of bony matrix. Whereas spongy bone, sometimes called cancellous bone, is this hollow, almost honeycomb-like structure of these interwoven plates of bone. So there's a lot of hollow pockets inside spongy bone. And what's really going on inside those hollow pockets of spongy bone, that's where you find red bone marrow. Here's a picture of red bone marrow, and what's going on within that red bone marrow is blood cell formation. Here's where we're going to draw one of these long bones. We'll see if we can fit 8 things on there. Maybe I can do it with this. Okay, let's label this as a sketch of a long bone. And I'll just, again, not the best artist, but we're just going to put 2 ends of a bone up here. We're going to label one end of this bone the proximal epiphysis. Down here, if this is representing this humerus bone that we just talked about, the proximal part is closer to the point of attachment, and then we've got the elbow part, the distal epiphysis down here. And in between those 2 epiphyses, we have the diaphysis of the bone, or the shaft of the bone. All right, let's add to that before we get to the inside of that. We're going to see that the distal and the proximal epiphysis are going to be covered in a layer of that articular cartilage. And that's just going to help protect the ends of these long bones from grinding together. If somebody has like really bad arthritis, then this articular cartilage has been worn away, and you've got bones that are grinding together and causing pain and swelling and damage. So let's label this as our articular cartilage. If I can spell it. Articular cartilage, this is a type of hyaline cartilage. It's on the ends of the type of hyaline cartilage that you find on the ends of long bones. Let's add one more thing to the outside of this bone before we go deeper into this, we're going to see on the very outside surface of these long bones, connecting that articular cartilage from the proximal epiphysis all the way down to the distal epiphysis, there's a layer of connective tissue that's just to the outside of these bones. You know, we were talking about a layer of connective tissue just to the outside of cartilage earlier, and we called it perichondrium because it was surrounding cartilage. This is connective tissue that's surrounding bone. So it gets a similar name. This is going to be periosteum. You can actually see that periosteum if I come over here to look at our model that represents compact bone. This stuff, this connective tissue that you see protecting the outer surface of compact bone is the periosteum. And if we look to the inside, there's also a layer of this blue connective tissue that represents a layer of connective tissue kind of lining this inside chamber. Let's draw that. The diaphysis of the bone, we're going to see, has this hollow middle chamber that we're going to call the medullary cavity. And you may see on your diagram that medullary cavity is going to be filled with yellow bone marrow. So filled with yellow bone marrow, and we know that yellow bone marrow is triglycerides. It's long-term energy storage. Sometimes in the field, if you come across a cow or a deer or something like that that's dead, you can look at you can break bones to see the composition of yellow bone marrow to tell something about the health of that individual before it died. Okay, so the medullary cavity, let me draw that layer of connective tissue that lines the inside of that medullary cavity. I'll draw it in an orange color. It lines the inside chamber of bone, so we're going to call it endosteum. And we saw it also on this model that I was picking up. Periosteum to the outside, endosteum right here to the inside. And if you look closely at this part of the model, you'll see that that endosteum is starting to wrap around these little interwoven plates of bone. The spongy bone is what we're about to label. And in fact, I'm going to just put some dots up here in the epiphyses of the bone. So the proximal epiphysis and the distal epiphysis, we're going to see is where you find spongy bone. And kind of the outer edges of the bone, almost to use like an M&M candy analogy, the compact bone is that hard exterior candy shell. And as we get to the middle of the bones, that's where we find our spongy bone. Spongy bone is where we're going to find red bone marrow. Filled with red bone marrow. And we know in red bone marrow is where you find blood cell formation taking place. We've got spongy bone. I'm going to label kind of just in this outer exterior shell of bone. This is where we find our compact bone. Let's see how we're doing. We've got periosteum, we got endosteum, we've got compact bone and spongy bone. We've got articular cartilage and medullary cavity. We've labeled our proximal and distal epiphysis, and we've got the shaft of that long bone, the diaphysis. We know the diaphysis is where we find that medullary cavity and the yellow bone marrow. Since we're going to try and get all the way into bone growth, I'm going to add one more thing to this, and I'll put it right here. It's this little line between the epiphysis and the diaphysis. Let's call this the epiphyseal line. This epiphyseal line is going to be important to mention when we start to talk about how the bone will grow in length. We'll see that and I'm giving this away right now, we're going to see that new bone cells are going to be laid down on the diaphysis side of this epiphyseal plate, or this epiphyseal line. So new cells laid down just on the diaphysis side of that epiphyseal line. So we'll mention that when we get back to talking about how bones grow in length. But right now, if we've labeled those 8 things that I wanted to label, we've got the diaphysis, we've got where compact bone and spongy bone is located, we've got the medullary cavity on here, we've got both epiphyses labeled, we've got the articular cartilage labeled, we even put that epiphyseal plate or that epiphyseal line on here. And here's the sketch of what I was attempting to draw. You can see the periosteum to the outside. Just underneath that periosteum is where we find our compact bone. We're about to zoom in on that compact bone to draw a little bit of that. You can see that medullary cavity filled with yellow bone marrow. You can see our epiphyseal line. And even when we look close, you can see how that compact bone is really just that exterior hard shell of the bone. And as we get deeper into that bone, it gives way to this interwoven plates of bone that we call spongy bone. I'm going to go back just a second to introduce this term because we see it a lot in this class. This term trabeculae just refers to these interwoven plates. So these interwoven plates of bone, spongy bone is one place where you see a lot of this trabeculae, these little interwoven plates. There's a bunch of trabeculae there. And in between those little pockets, like we said, is where you find that red bone marrow. Periosteum to the outside, some of these cells are going to, it's like when we were talking about in cartilage, some of the perichondrium cells could convert themselves into cartilage cells. We're going to see some of these periosteum cells can convert themselves into actual bone cells. And we've introduced bone cells before. Osteo tells us that it has something to do with bone, and if it's an osteoblast, that blast tells us it's building something, a bone-forming cell. The osteoclast are going to be the ones that dissolve bone. Osteogenic stem cells, those are the ones that could be either osteoblast or osteoclast. They have not yet committed to becoming either one of those. And an osteocyte is just a mature bone cell. It's not building, it's not tearing down, it's just maintaining whatever is there. And we've labeled our endosteum as lining that medullary cavity. Here's where we're going to start to zoom in to parts of that compact bone. And as we start to zoom in, you can see these little overlapping rings right there. I'm going to have to get rid of our to-do list. Is everybody good with our to-do list on the board? All right, here it goes. I'm about to draw the compact bone thing there. And the point that I'm going to try and make is that when you're looking at these overlapping, what I refer to as tree ring-like structures, you can see how they, well, maybe let me say it this way. I'm trying to describe how they're really closely packed together, but it might be better for me to draw something real quick. Let me use an analogy and compare it this way. If we were, it's hot right now. I had to pack a cooler over the weekend. So if you've packed a cooler full of drinks, you've got all of these cans. Let's say we're going to try and fit the maximum amount of cans in a cooler. So we stack all of these cans right next to one another. And we've got the maximum number of cans in this cooler. Now we want to go start fitting ice in the cooler. The only place we can kind of fit this ice is right in between some of these cans. That's the only space where these little gaps for ice to fit in. That might be helpful if you're trying to cool down some of these drinks. But this is not how the osteons are arranged in compact bone. If you look at how these osteons are arranged, instead of this cans in a cooler type of arrangement, we see these osteons doing this this overlapping stuff like this. Right? There's no gaps. There's no place where I could fit ice cubes in between these structures. Each one of these rounded things is going to be called an osteon. And we're going to draw one of these osteons, that one little structure. We're going to see that each one kind of looks like a bullseye, where it's got these repeating rings. And I've drawn a bunch of these overlapping osteons, and each one is going to have this little central canal in the middle. And then around that central canal, we're going to have these plates of bony matrix. So this is what compact bone looks like. One of the reasons it's so tough is because there aren't any gaps in between these osteons. They're overlapping, so that makes a nice effective seal, a nice hard exterior shell. Now to label one of those osteons, I'm going to need to give myself a little bit more space. So let me start over again. We're going to see if we can draw an osteon and maybe label 5 things on it. And I think you have this sketch on one of those pages. Excellent. Then I'm going to start by drawing one of these large osteons. So this whole thing is one osteon. Each osteon is going to have a central canal. And then I'm going to make my central canal just a little bit bigger because I want to put something in the middle of it. This central canal is where you're going to find blood vessels like an artery, a vein, and I'll just use a green color, if I can find it, to represent nerves. So you've got blood vessels and nerves that run through this central canal. And then surrounding that central canal, we're going to have these repeating rings of bony matrix. Each ring of bony matrix is called a lamella. We're going to look at 2 different types of lamella. The one that I'm drawing here that look like rings on a dartboard, these are going to be called concentric lamella because they form these concentric rings. So concentric lamella, each one of these rings is a plate of bony matrix. We'll say bony matrix. And the matrix of bone tissue is mostly calcium phosphate. So it's this brittle stuff. We've got our central canal, we've got our concentric lamella. Now, in between those little rings of lamella is where you're going to find these cells that maintain, they build, and then they also maintain these plates of bony matrix. I'm going to draw each one of them in here. You know, they're not found in the middle of these lamella. They're found in these little rings, kind of in between each lamella. That is the osteocyte. And each of these osteocytes are within a lacuna. Kind of like we were talking about in cartilage, each chondrocyte was inside its own little lacuna. And each osteocyte is also going to be inside its own little lacuna. When we look at these osteocytes, they kind of look like little ticks where they've got these cellular projections that kind of reach out in either direction. And what they're doing really is they're maintaining the presence of that bony matrix. We said they're not building it, they're not tearing it down, they're just maintaining the presence of that bony matrix. So these cells are doing work. They need nutrients, they need blood supply that goes to them, and they need their waste washed away. And how they get nutrients delivered to them is it comes from these blood vessels in that central canal. We have these tiny little canals that radiate out from the central canal, and they deliver nutrients to these outer osteocytes and the outer lamella. So I'm just going to draw these tiny little canals that are radiating out away from this central canal, and we're going to label that tiny little canal a canaliculi. Actually, I'm going to label just one of them a canaliculus. Collectively, they would all be referred to as canaliculi. Those tiny little canals that deliver nutrients from the central canal out to those outer lamella. All right, I'm happy with that. We got 5 things on there. We've labeled it as an osteon. We know that each osteon has its central canal that have those tiny canaliculi that radiate out away from that central canal. They deliver nutrients even to those outer lamella, which are being maintained by those osteocytes. Let's try and catch up with these slides. So we've drawn compact bone because we can see those osteons. And in spongy bone, like we said, there are no osteons. Instead, you see these interwoven plates of bone that we referred to as trabeculae. Cells of bony tissue, I know we've introduced these also when we talked about tissues last time, but osteoblasts are these cells right here that build bone tissue. Not that you have to recognize what an osteoblast looks like, but if you saw the description of a cell that is responsible for building bone or for bone growth, think osteoblast. We don't have to know the picture of what these things look like. This is an osteoclast that we'll see in a short little video, produces these digestive enzymes that dissolve bony matrix and then can release calcium into the bloodstream. We don't have to know what an osteoclast looks like, but we need to know what it does. So bone resorption, kind of dissolving bone, is the job of this osteoclast. And then the osteocyte, the ones that we were drawing in here that look kind of like little tick structures because they had cellular projections. Those projections reach out into this concentric lamella and really kind of maintain the presence of that calcium phosphate matrix. Okay, to this diagram that we're drawing, we've just put on the board an osteon. And you may notice in your textbook an osteon is also referred to as a Haversian system. You can use either one, Haversian system or osteon. It's the basic structural unit of compact bone. And we've drawn one of those on there. We've also added the lamella, those plates of bony matrix that kind of radiate out around that central canal. The central canal could also be referred to as the Haversian canal. Feel free to use either one. We know these tiny little canals that radiate out from the central canal are the canaliculi. What I didn't draw on here is these perforating canals. And to show that, I'm going to need to get this bone model. Okay. If I show this bone model this way, what we're looking at is we're just looking at this layer of compact bone. And these structures that look like wedding cakes are individual osteons that have kind of popped off the top of this model. And it is showing us these concentric rings of lamella. And you can see that each osteon has its own central canal with a blood vessel that comes through it, just sticking out of the top. One of your questions might be, I know it was a question for me, well, if each of these central canals, let me say this another way. If each of these osteons has its own blood vessel coming up through that central canal, where do those blood vessels come from? And the answer is, if I flip this model on the side, you can see running kind of perpendicularly through all of these osteons, through all of the compact bone, is this blood vessel that we refer to as this perforating canal. And in fact, let me say something about this model real quick, because it is kind of helps describe different things that we see on these models. If I show you this side of the model, what we're looking at is those perforating canals, or these Volkmann's canals, with blood vessels running through them. And the blood vessel that runs through this Volkmann's canal is the blood vessel that delivers fresh blood to each of these vertically running central canals. So perforating canals connect all of these central canals. If I flip around and show you this side of the model, this is now representing bone that is no longer alive, and the blood vessel has been removed from it. And what we can see left behind is this actual perforating canal, or that Volkmann's canal. Also, if you look at this side of the model, if you look close, can you see those little holes, those little indentions there? that is showing us a part of the model where the osteocytes are no longer there. So this is saying that this is dead bone. If I flip back around to this side, you may be able to see at the back of the room, I'm not sure. But there, at least on this part of the model, there are these little black tick-looking structures. Can everybody see that? This is representing a part of the bone that's still alive. And you've got those osteocytes hanging out in between those lamella. You can see the little black osteocytes. And then notice in some of those parts, those osteocytes have been covered up. If we just look at it from the top view, you can see in places where they have not added the osteocyte, you can just see that little pocket, that little blank lacuna, that space. And then other places they've gone ahead and put in that osteocyte within that lacuna. So living bone tissue, and then here's where all the cells and the blood vessels have been removed. They do that with these different models, and it can be confusing. So let's look at this on a picture. Here is the thing I was just referring to, that you've got all of these central canals that run kind of up and down vertically through bone. And then you have running perpendicularly these perforating canals or Volkmann's canals that make sure each of those central canals are filled with blood. Kind of like we were trying to look at our diagram. If you look to the very inside of one of those osteons, we'll see the central canal houses blood vessels and nerves. Even if we can zoom in on that a little bit, here we can see those plates of bony matrix that we called lamella. These are concentric lamella because they form those rings. And then we see those osteocytes inside that little lacuna. You can even see those little cellular projections. And the the connection of each of these tiny little grooves is how nutrients diffuses from this central canal out to those outer lamella. And those tiny little grooves, like we said, were the canaliculi. So we've labeled all 5 of those things on there. Does everybody feel okay about that with that part of the sketch? Then let's move past compact bone into spongy bone. We don't see osteons at all in spongy bone. If you see one of these, you know you're not looking at spongy bone. We would expect instead to see these trabeculae, these little interwoven plates of bone. All of that is the spongy bone that we're referring to. Just like this picture that we saw. And in those hollow pockets of spongy bone is where you find blood cell formation by way of a bunch of red bone marrow. One of these links, I don't know if it actually works. I'm going to jump over that for just a second. I'll come back and maybe show that at some point. It just shows the activity of an osteoblast or the activity of an osteoclast. And you know this is going to be building or laying down new bone tissue, where the osteoclast is going to be dissolving bone tissue. This just shows stress lines going through bones. It's also one of the reasons why you find compact bone around the outside of the bone and spongy bone in the middle. That just adds to the structural strength of bones, that it has this hard exterior shell and then kind of a hollow diaphysis. Lightens the overall weight of the bone, allows it to support more weight. These are videos of bone remodeling. I'll also see which one of those is still relevant at some point, and we'll bring it back as a review. But let me just describe this process of bone remodeling. We've talked about compact bone, we've talked about spongy bone, and we've talked about the cells that either dissolve bone or lay down new bone. So here's where we're kind of building our way towards bone growth, or what we call bone modeling. In order to build bone or to model bone, we're going to need the components of bone. Most of the organic matter of bone is going to be collagen fibers and protein. In fact, when you look at these structures on here, this wedding cake that we can see represents an osteon. You can see these little grooves that are running in kind of opposite directions on each of those lamella. Those are collagen fibers that really kind of stitch this thing together. The inorganic substances are going to be a substance called hydroxyapatite that that term hydroxyapatite it's a molecule combined of calcium and phosphate. And that is what gives this bone its brittle, how can I say that? It's what makes the matrix of the bone so brittle. Unlike other types of extracellular matrix, this with a lot of calcium phosphate is very brittle, which is good if you're looking for structural support, protection of those internal organs.
Sorry, so for the composition of the bone, that's for both compact and spongy?
Correct. Compact bone and spongy bone. When we're laying down new bone tissue, we'll see inorganic. The main inorganic matter is hydroxyapatite, and one of the main organic substances is the collagen fiber that's going to stitch that together. We're about to see this process of osteogenesis, which is it's a fancy way of saying bone formation. I think where are we at in this part? Yeah, this is number 14 on page 4. It says bone formation is known as osteogenesis or ossification. So osteogenesis is just building new bone from stuff that was not previously bone tissue. So you can say osteogenesis or ossification. Those are two different ways of describing bone formation. We'll see first how bones form in the first place. So from birth to 2 months old, how do these bones form? And then once the bones form, once you're 2 months old and you've got some bones, you're going to continue to grow. And as your body grows, it's going to have to support more weight. So the bones are going to have to change from when you're 2 months old to when you hit adulthood. And then as you continue to age, your bones are going to get remodeled. So we talk a lot about use it or lose it in here. And if you don't use things, your body will likely not spend the energy to develop it. There was, what was that guy, the astronaut guy that went up and lived in space for like a year, and then whenever he came back, he found that his bone density had dropped significantly, because if you're in a weightless environment in space, there's nothing to stimulate bone deposition. And so the same thing happens if you're on bed rest. Like when I go see people in the nursing homes a lot, if you're not walking around actively using, your bones, then you will lose bone density. It's one of the reasons why you see sometimes people that do these extreme workouts will put on like a backpack with extra weight and run up and down steps. And what they're really doing is they're trying to stimulate bone deposition and bone growth. So if you're having to carry extra weight, then your body will respond by adding more bone deposition. So the body can react to how you're using it, basically. We'll start with forming bone in the first place from stuff that was not previously bone. One way of forming new bones is called intramembranous ossification. Let's tear that apart. Intra just means within something, in the middle of something. And the second part, membranous, tells us that we're talking about, and again, ossification is bone formation. So this is another way of saying we've got bones that are forming in the middle of membranes. All of the flat bones, like the parietal bones, the scapula, the rib bones, these flat bones, they started out as sheets of connective tissue. And those sheets of connective tissue got hardened, calcified into actual bone tissue. So intramembranous ossification is going to form flat bones. There is another type of bone formation that's more common. The second type of bone formation is called endochondral ossification. So we know ossification is bone formation. Endo tells us inside something, and then the word chondral tells us what it is inside of. This is bone formation that is occurring inside cartilage. And most of the bones formed this way through endochondral ossification. All of the long bones and most of the other bones in the body formed this way. This is a picture of what we're seeing there is endochondral skeleton. This is a skeleton made out of cartilage, and as you grow and develop, these bones that initially form out of hyaline cartilage are going to get slowly replaced, converted into bone tissue. So it's currently hyaline cartilage, and it's going to get converted to bone tissue, and that happens in a series of steps. I feel like you've got some kind of diagram like this towards the back of your handout. I know we're kind of jumping around on those pages. But if we're thinking about endochondral ossification, here's a picture of endochondral ossification. It's bone formation that occurs in the middle of a piece of cartilage. So we start off with just a piece of cartilage, and you can see some of those cells, some of those chondrocytes are going to start to swell and die off. This happens as this tissue starts to harden. So we've got a piece of cartilage, and then the first thing that starts to happen, look at how there is a bone collar that starts to form around the exterior of this piece of cartilage. The other clue that I want you to notice is that when we were talking about cartilage, we said cartilage has no blood supply, it has no nerve supply. Bone tissue, on the other hand, does have nerve supply, and it does have blood supply. And that first blood vessel that shows up, you can see what it's doing is it's delivering these osteoblasts, and it's laying down a thin layer of bone. This is what we call a bone collar. So a bone collar forms around the outside, and then you can see those same blood vessels that delivered the first osteoblast that built this bone collar. Those blood vessels will make their way towards the inside of the diaphysis. And what they're doing there is they're basically delivering osteoblast and osteoclast. The osteoclast are going to dissolve out this center portion of the newly developing bone and create this marrow cavity. So osteoclasts kind of start to dissolve this hollow pocket, and then right behind them there are osteoblasts that lay down this spongy bone. This process of bone formation that starts to occur in the diaphysis is what we call the primary ossification center. It's the first place where a blood vessel made its way to the interior, to the part of this, what used to be cartilage, and is now going to convert it into actual bone tissue. So we see osteoblast and osteoclast being delivered to the diaphysis of this bone. That's our primary ossification center. And once this marrow cavity starts to expand, we will see, and this is just showing us that the marrow cavity has now kind of started to grow and expand. It's going to lead to additional ossification centers that happen at the epiphyses. So notice the primary ossification center occurs in the diaphysis, and as this diaphysis grows and starts to elongate, the second ossification centers occur at the proximal and distal epiphyses. Again, blood vessels have to make their way towards the interior of either of those epiphyses. They deliver osteoclast and osteoblast. The osteoclast hollow out the little pocket, and osteoblast line it in spongy bone cells. So this is endochondral ossification, how we go from a piece of cartilage into actual bone. Thinking of bone growth, I kind of was mentioning it right here a little bit when we were talking about bones growing in length. Kind of like we were talking about ways in which cartilage grows, we'll see that there's two ways that we can describe bone growth. And it's the same two words, really. So don't let that be confusing. When we're talking about bone growth, the term interstitial growth describes bones getting longer. Last time in cartilage, we said that just describes growth from within when we were talking about cartilage growing. Interstitial growth in bones is bone growing in length. I thought I had a picture of that yet, but it looks like the next picture is a picture of bones growing in width. So when a bone grows wider, this type of bone growth is called oppositional growth. So the thickness of the bone increases, but to be clear by what we mean by thickness of the bone, I wanted to go to this slide because this is representing the bone, a cross-section through the bone of an infant. And this infant's bone is going to change. It's going to get remodeled as it grows from an infant into an adult. The adult bone we can see is much thicker, But in order to lay down this new bone along the outside, old bone had to be removed. This is kind of a thing that's worth pointing out, that you don't have endless amounts of calcium and phosphate in your body to build new bone. So if you have these osteoblasts who are going to try and lay down new bony matrix, they need to get those raw materials from somewhere. And one way that these bone building cells, the osteoblast, can get resources is by working with an osteoclast. So I'm a bone cell, I'm trying to build new bone, I'm running out of calcium phosphate. Well, there's an osteoclast dissolving other bones that I'm not using. And those resources, the calcium and phosphate, go into the bloodstream, and now as an osteoblast I can use those resources and lay down new bone. So this process of bone remodeling, you have osteoclast that dissolve old bone, and as those resources, the calcium and phosphate, go into the bloodstream, osteoblasts are going to grab that and lay down new bone where it's needed. So this process of removing old bone and laying down new bone is our bone remodeling.
I had a question.
Yes?
For one of the questions here, it says it's the growth region that allows long bone to grow in length. Is that talking about the epiphyseal line or the...
That's right, epiphyseal line or epiphyseal plate. That's right where we're going.
Okay, I didn't know if it was that or the thing we just talked, the interstitial.
So that's right. So interstitial growth is the bone growing in length. And where that occurs is on the diaphysis side of this epiphyseal line. So you're thinking right, this epiphyseal line has something to do with the bone growing in length. And the process of the bone getting longer is what we call interstitial growth. And if we want to look to see exactly how that interstitial growth takes place, which is where we're going, that now brings into this epiphyseal line. So we kind of sketched this on the board, and we said if we're going to think about bones growing in length, this interstitial growth, we need to really pay attention to the diaphysis side of this epiphyseal line. And if we look closely, we're going to see 4 different regions. One region that we call proliferative region. All that's happening in this proliferative region is intense cell division. You've got mitosis rapidly giving you additional cells. This hypertrophic region we're going to see is when the cells swell up. And kind of these two things are what give the thrust to the bone growing in length. You get more cells, and then each of those cells start to swell. And that's what kind of provides this growing force.
So for 14, the third one, like down, I guess. I don't know if that's making sense. It starts with the sentence starts with the. It would be epiphyseal plate. That's the answer.
The epiphyseal plate is the growth region that allows the long bone to grow in length. That's right.
But the growth in length is called interstitial growth. That's not a question. I'm just asking.
Correct. I thought that was on there somewhere. Maybe it's.
The appositional bone is on there.
So oppositional, that would be the bone growing in width.
The diameter.
The diameter gets larger. That's right.
Thank you.
So number 14, I don't have anything filled in here. I'm just going to read through this. I would put bone formation is known as osteogenesis or ossification. It looks like the next one is in endochondral ossification, hyaline cartilage is replaced by bony tissue. And that's kind of what we were just looking at. The next line there says this epiphyseal line, or you could put epiphyseal plate, is the growth region that allows long bones to grow in length. We're about to zoom into that on this very next slide. And then after that, it would be in intramembranous ossification. Connective tissue membranes are replaced by bony tissue.
Can you repeat that?
Yep. This is I guess the 4th line under 14. It says in intramembranous ossification. I'm going to go back to this picture. In this intramembranous ossification, connective tissue membranes are replaced by bony tissue. And then the 5th line there is growth of bone in diameter is this. It's our oppositional bone growth. And then the last line there is what I was kind of referring to there. The process of bone remodeling involves the removal of old bone and the replacement of that with new bone. So to remodel bone, we have to dissolve old bone and then use those resources to lay down new bone. And then that takes us to 15, where we've got our sketch of the osteon and at least 4 or 5 things that we labeled on that. Does everybody feel good about that one?
So
Sure.
Ossification for 14, you said ossification for what else? What's the other word?
Well, so there's 2 of them that there's a blank followed by ossification. The first one, where there's a blank followed by the word ossification, that's the second line under 14. That would be endochondral ossification, talking about where hyaline cartilage is replaced by bone. And then the fourth line down there, the second time where you see a blank followed by the word ossification, that is this intramembranous ossification, because that's describing connective tissue membranes being replaced with bone.
And then, sorry, I have one more question.
You're good.
On 13, the first one is osteocytes, and the second one is osteoblasts.
Maintaining bone cells, that first one for 13 is osteocyte. The second one, where we have bone forming cells, is an osteoblast, if we're forming cells. Phagocytic cells responsible for bone resorption, that's the osteoclast. And then once again, cells found within the lacuna of bone tissue, these here on the model, those are also osteocytes. So you've got osteocytes, the top and the bottom of number 13. Yeah, good job. Let me know if there's any of them that we fly past. Let's catch back up. We were talking about bone growth, and here on the next slide is where we zoom in to this epiphyseal line. Here is a close-up of this epiphyseal line, and here is the original shape of the bone. In this other picture, this red dotted outline shows you the original shape of the bone, but what's happened is you can see that this bone has gotten taller. It's this interstitial bone. The bone is growing in length. And in order to do that, we need to look closely at this diaphysis side of the epiphyseal plate. So if you look at this top part up here, that little light portion, that's the epiphyseal line or epiphyseal plate that we're zooming into. So that epiphyseal line would be right here where the red dot is going back and forth. And just to the diaphysis side of that epiphyseal line, what we see here is this proliferative zone. All the proliferative zone is it's a bunch of cells that are rapidly going through mitosis. So you can just see intense cell division. We've got a bunch of new cells that show up in this proliferative zone. And then following that proliferative zone, you can see how each of those cells is starting to swell and become larger. That kind of growing of each of those cells is what provides this thrust for the bone to grow in length. After this hypertrophic zone, where the cells are swelling up, we start to see that the cells take on a bunch of calcium and phosphate. So they start to harden. This is the calcification zone. So osteoblasts, you can see, are laying down new calcium deposits. And after they do their work, we now have formed actual bone. So this ossification zone is the final stage where you've gone from new cells. Those cells have swollen. They've taken on a bunch of calcium phosphate deposits, and now they've formed actual bony matrix. What was the question? I still didn't hear that. What was that?
What forms the bone matrix?
So osteoblast are what lay down the bony matrix. And then kind of following up on bones growing in length. I know we're not really in the endocrine part of the semester yet, but we will talk about growth hormone and how growth hormone affects bone growth. And particularly if we think about how growth hormone affects bone growth, it affects this proliferation zone. It affects how many new cells are formed during mitosis. So if you have additional growth hormone, excess growth hormone, it's going to give you more cells in this proliferative zone, so more cells are going to swell and elongate, and your bones are going to be even longer. Here's an individual that has hypersecretion of growth hormone. This is sometimes referred to as gigantism. Everything about the rest of the body is normal, except the proportions of the bones are much longer than they normally would be. in somebody that has hypersecretion of growth hormone. Contrasted to that, we can see what's known as dwarfism. This is a situation where there is an insufficient amount of growth hormone. So if you look, the only real noticeable difference here is that the proportions of the bones are shorter than they normally would be. And again, that's just due to lack of stimulation of that proliferative zone. So growth hormone causes the bones to grow in length. Additional growth hormone, you get really long bones. Lack of growth hormones, you get short bones. Another thing that we already pointed this out, but another thing that is important when we think about bones is the fact that bones are really the place where we store excess calcium. We said it's needed for the heart to beat, for nerves to send signals to one another, for cells to divide. And I used this in our first couple of lectures when we were talking about homeostasis. And we said that if you're in a situation where there's not enough calcium in the bloodstream to build new bones. So we've got a deficit of calcium in the bloodstream. One way that we can get additional calcium is for that parathyroid hormone to release its secretions, this parathyroid hormone that goes and stimulates these osteoclasts to dissolve bone. So this is a good example of negative feedback. The stimulus is that we don't have enough calcium in the bloodstream. So the response is to counter that stimulus and increase the amount of calcium in the bloodstream, bringing us right back up to normal. Just for fun, I guess, does anybody remember what hormone would be responsible for responding if we had too much calcium in the bloodstream? I've got so much calcium in my bloodstream, my heart is starting to lock up. I was just asking, and this is for fun really, here we're saying that parathyroid hormone is going to increase blood calcium levels if they get too low. But we saw in our introduction of homeostasis last time, there is another hormone that kicks in to respond if we're in the opposite situation where instead of too little calcium, we've got too much calcium in the bloodstream. No, not what I'm thinking of. So yeah, parathyroid hormone comes from these parathyroid glands. It stimulates these osteoclasts to dissolve bone, increases calcium in the bloodstream. But we said there was another hormone called calcitonin. Again, this is for fun. We'll talk about this in the second half of the semester. But calcitonin would respond if there's too much calcium in the bloodstream, and it stimulates osteoblast activity. An osteoblast then are going to grab all of this calcium from the bloodstream and build new bone, thus dropping that free calcium level in the bloodstream back down to normal levels. I was just pointing out really their calcium balance is done by this working of osteoclast versus osteoblast. We need more calcium, stimulate osteoclast. We got too much calcium, stimulate the osteoblast. The next few slides just point out the stages of bone healing. I don't know if this... Oh, I did put it on there. Yeah, number 17 is an actual picture of the stages that occur whenever you break a bone. So if you have broken a bone, one of the first things that happens is this blood clot that forms called a hematoma. And we know this, I've been showing you this a bunch of times, blood tissue is highly vascularized. There's lots of blood vessels that go through this. So if you were to snap a bone, there would be a lot of blood flow that would pool together and form this hematoma. Now, quickly following that hematoma, this is important. You know, you've got osteoblasts that are going to come in here and start to lay down new bone and try and seal together this bone that's been broken. After this hematoma forms, the second stage is what's called this cartilaginous callus, or this fibrocartilaginous callus that forms. That hematoma that was once just a pocket of blood starts to convert into this connective tissue. We're thinking collagen fibers. It's basically these ligaments that form that is a bone-to-bone connection. And while it's still a fibrous connection, it's just referred to as the fibrocartilaginous callus. But this callus made out of fibers is going to get replaced by actual bony matrix. So in the third phase, this bony callus forms where osteoblasts have come in here and laid down new bony matrix. And I haven't broken a bone recently, but if you have broken a bone recently, after it heals, you sometimes can feel these little exterior bumps where you've broken the bone. You can see how there's that little bump that, well, there's a hematoma now, but this bump would not have been present before you broke the bone. Those little exterior bumps are due to additional bony deposits when osteoblasts were sealing together this broken bone. Those bumps will go away, so as the bone is remodeled as you continue to live, those additional bumps are kind of eroded away by osteoclast, and then that calcium is used other places in the body. So hematoma forms first, then you have this fibrocartilaginous callus that's a temporary connection between the bones, and then that fibrocartilaginous callus gets replaced by bony matrix, thanks to the working of those osteoblasts. That forms these little bony calluses that get replaced as the bone gets remodeled and finally repairs itself. So that takes about 6 to 8 weeks to occur. What else? I think there's only 2 other slides on here, and this just points out the fact that as you grow older, one of the things that happens is that your osteoclasts, the activity of those osteoclasts will outpace the activity of osteoblast. And when osteoblasts are not depositing as much bone as the osteoclasts are dissolving, you get this osteoporosis, or bones that are not as dense, they're more brittle. Like I said, if you are on bed rest for long periods of time or live up in the space station for a year, these are all things that will cause osteoporosis. Or just getting old is one thing that will cause osteoporosis, which we go through a lot in here, talking about how the body deals with aging. But like I always stress, old age is a gift denied to many. So, hopefully we're all lucky enough to have to deal with osteoporosis at some point. But that's the last slide for this PowerPoint. If we need to take a short little break, I don't know how I'm doing on time.
No, it's good.
All right, I think most of us are back. Are we ready to roll into the second half of this to see how far we can get? I promise I'll stop at some point to let you get your hands on these lab models and start to look at some of the bones. It's really this second PowerPoint where we start to look at actual bones and the bone markings that you'll find on that lab list. We've already named bones based off of their shape and named bones based off of their location. So here's where we start to separate bones in terms of axial skeleton. Everything in green here, so the skull, the vertebral column, the rib cage is all the axial skeleton. And then the appendages are in this kind of a yellowish color, the lower appendages and upper appendages, as well as the bones that attach them to the rest of the skeleton. I'm hoping that we can get through the axial skeleton today. Skull, hyoid bone that I mentioned earlier, vertebral column and rib cage, and we'll save all the appendicular skeleton stuff for Tuesday. We've already seen this, so we talked about those bone markings and those vocabulary terms like foramen and process, sinus, condyle, all of these things that come back a lot. And I think some of the first places where we start to see them is at the very beginning of this axial skeleton. We'll start by looking at the skull bones. And I'm just going to show one thing real quick. If I end this slide, in D2L, towards the bottom, there is a handout that I forgot to print out and bring you copies of. But you can print this off of D2L. It's just these skull coloring diagrams. They look something like this. It's not for a grade. It's just for additional practice. And this comes from that anatomy coloring book. What you're supposed to do up here is choose a color of a pen or a map color. and then kind of fill in, say, that word occipital with a blue color maybe, and then the word parietal with a green color, and then use that same color that you used to color in the word occipital. You would then fill in that occipital bone with the same color. And maybe if you used parietal with a green color, you could color that parietal bone in with the same green color. And even though that seems kind of redundant, there's just something about coordinating that muscle movement when you're thinking about something that just gets it to transfer into long-term memory much easier. So that's why I always found those coloring books helpful, because it just burned it into long-term memory better. So that's the idea with there. We have a couple more of these coming back when we get into muscle tissue and things like that. But in addition to these coloring diagrams, we have in lab skulls that have the bones are colored slightly different colors and they come apart. So I have one of these skulls over here that's somewhat intact, so that you can see how all of these bones go together. And it's really nice to learn from, because you can see where one bone stops and the next bone begins. This is where the frontal bone stops and the parietal bone begins, and now we've got a temporal bone and an occipital bone down here. It's helpful, but this is not the one that I'll use for the practical. I will use one of these other skulls that doesn't have different colors on them, but I tend to use the ones that are at least you can easily see these suture lines. There are skulls over here that I guess probably saved a little bit of money, where they didn't really color in the suture lines very well. So I tend to not favor these as well. I might use them if I'm just asking the name of a bone. But if I'm looking for bone markings or some details, I'll try and use one that shows these sutural lines on it, so you can see where one bone stops and the next bones begin. That's really helpful when you get around the orbit and things like that. So beware of those different skull models. This one, like I said, is a good one to learn from. And on your second handout, this first page we might be able to answer after we go through the appendicular skeleton. So you'll compare, of all the bones we've seen, which one was part of the axial skeleton and which one was part of the appendicular skeleton. But if we flip over that page, somewhere down there, on the second page, there's a bunch of bone markings. We're about to go down several of those. But I'm flipping over to, it looks like question number 21, where it says list the 8 bones that make up the cranium. And you can see next to that, I've put a little number 2 or a little number 1 to tell you whether or not those bones are paired or whether there's just one of them. There's my clicker. So the 8 bones that make up the cranium start right here. The frontal bone, I'll try and use this color skull to show what's going on here. We've got our frontal bone, which is our forehead bone. That's easy to recognize. That is, if we kind of go past that frontal bone, we'll see the top of the skull is made up of these 2 parietal bones. Looking at the side view, we can just see one of these parietal bones, but if I were to flip this over, well, this isn't really the best view of the top of the skull, but you can see how there are these 2 parietal bones that make up the top of the skull. We've got our frontal bone and then those 2 parietal bones. And if I can go back to the side view, after we go past these parietal bones, there's just one occipital bone. So think back of the skull for occipital bone. The occipital bone is blue in this model. One frontal bone, one occipital bone. We've got 2 parietal bones, and we also have 2 of these temporal bones, one on either side. On this model, the temporal bone is brown. But what I like about this colorful model, you can just take this temporal bone off all by itself, and you can see that this temporal bone has a bunch of these little projections. There is what we're going to call the zygomatic process of this temporal bone. There's a little styloid process, that pointy little process. And then there's kind of this blunted process. This is our mastoid process. I was just pointing to this little styloid process and this zygomatic process. That's maybe worth reviewing. We were just talking about anytime you hear the word process as a bone marking, that's referring to a protrusion, some part of the bone that sticks out. So mastoid process is the big one. Styloid process is the little one. That's easy. But this part of the bone that is a process, we're going to call this part of the bone the zygomatic process of this temporal bone. And that makes sense because it's part of the temporal bone. Let me catch back up. It's part of the temporal bone, and specifically, it's the part of the temporal bone that is progressing towards this zygomatic bone. You'll see this on the lab list. Notice if I'm pointing right here, this is the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. But if I move the pointer to right here, we're now talking about this zygomatic bone. And the zygomatic bone has its own processes. Notice how there's this part of the zygomatic bone that's progressing towards the temporal bone. This would be the temporal process of the zygomatic bone. Here is also a process of the zygomatic bone. This is the process on the zygomatic bone that is progressing towards the frontal bone. So we would call this the frontal process of the zygomatic bone. This is the maxillary process of the zygomatic bone. This is the maxilla that holds in the top teeth. Not a cranial bone, it's a facial bone. So let's get back to the other two cranial bones. We've seen frontal bone, we've seen parietal bone, we've seen occipital bone, and these two temporal bones. So to see the other two cranial bones, we need to kind of get into the inside part of the skull. We're going to see the sphenoid bone and the ethmoid bone. Both of these are highly irregularly shaped. And just for reference, can you kind of see, I don't know if what the color situation is like for everybody, but there is this bone right here that, I don't know, that's not really a red color, maybe a fuchsia color. I don't know, does anybody co-sign on that? You can see that little, that is a side of this sphenoid bone. Let's look at it from the top. One of my favorite places to show that sphenoid bone, here we go. We're just going to grab one of these skulls and we're going to take the top of it off. And now when we look back down Now when we look back down into the top of this skull, it's outlined by these suture lines. You can kind of see this bone that some people describe it as like a bat-shaped bone. Looking at it from below, you can kind of see how it has these wings that come out. This is the bottom of the sphenoid bone. So if you look at the bottom of the skull, you can see parts of the sphenoid bone. I kind of like to show the sphenoid bone from the top of the skull because there's this little structure right there. When you look at this on an actual skull model, you'll see there's a little depression right there. This is a structure on the sphenoid bone called the sella turcica. Let's see if I can show it from a side view at all. There it is. It's even labeled. That sella turcica is this part of the sphenoid bone that we have to know. I think it's the first thing that's labeled. And like I said, I put in order of importance those bone markings that you needed to be aware of underneath the name of each of those bones. So sphenoid bone is one of these large bones. And if I go back to looking directly into the skull this way, this sphenoid bone makes up the back of the eye sockets. Here they're coloring that sphenoid bone as kind of a purplish color. So sphenoid bone, there's only one of those. And then we can also see that other bone of the cranium that really is found in the interior part of the nasal cavity. If you go up to the superior part of the nasal cavity, here in green, we can see parts of the ethmoid bone. Let me see if I can jump around to see parts of the ethmoid bone. So we can see the sphenoid bone, but the ethmoid bone in this picture, if you can make out that little orange sliver right behind that green bone, that orange sliver, that's going to be part of the ethmoid bone. Looking at it from above, this is also one of my favorite places to show ethmoid bone. On these models, just anterior to the sphenoid bone, you're going to see, can you see how the frontal bone is a little bit different of a yellow color, where this ethmoid bone is maybe a little bit darker orange or golden colored? I don't know. There's a little bit of a different coloration there, and it's just that little part that we can see. This is the superior part of the ethmoid bone. We're looking at the ethmoid bone from above. And over here, you can't really see much of the ethmoid bone from below. Let me flip to a couple of different pictures. Again, ethmoid bone is in the superior part of this nasal cavity. So let me click over here. Again, we've seen sella turcica, and that ethmoid bone is just anterior to that. This looks a lot like the skull that I'm trying to hold up, and you may be able to see those suture lines that come up and over this one little structure. It looks like the fin of a surfboard that's sticking up. That little fin that sticks up like a keel or something that sticks up, that structure is called the crista galli, and it is on your lab list. On any of these skull models that you grab, and all of these are just melted plastic, so sometimes when you're looking for a crista galli that sticks up, you might happen to grab one of these that is not as easy to recognize. So I sometimes like to flip through here. Let's see what we got here. Not the best. This is a good one though. Can you see that little fin, that little bony fin that's sticking straight up? That structure is the crista galli. And that might be the best thing to find to see that you're looking at part of the ethmoid bone. On most of these models, once you find that crista galli, that fin that sticks up, you'll notice that on either side of that fin, there is what looks like a floor that has holes punched in it. You can see those little holes. Those holes are called olfactory foramina. And here's where those come in. If we look at this half head model, there is these olfactory bulbs. They actually sit right on top of that ethmoid bone. And these little olfactory nerves that penetrate down into the superior part of the nasal cavity, they actually make their way through those tiny holes in the cribriform plate.
That's what makes you smell, isn't it?
That's correct, that's right. So you would pick up all the sensation of olfaction or smell through those olfactory nerves, and they get into the nasal cavity through those holes in the cribriform plate. So we're thinking part of the ethmoid bone. Let me see if I can I thought I had a couple of other views of this. Sphenoid bone and ethmoid bone is really what we're talking about. This is a sphenoid bone all by itself, and I took one of these out of the colorful skull to just kind of show you this sphenoid bone. You can tell it's a highly irregularly shaped bone. Maybe the most noteworthy structure on there that we'll have to know is that sella turcica. And I pointed about that ethmoid bone with the crista galli that kind of sticks right out of the middle of that cribriform plate. Here's an ethmoid bone. It's also a highly irregularly shaped bone. On the lab list, you'll notice under the ethmoid bone, it has somewhere on there the ethmoid sinuses. You have that on the lab list. You can cross that out if you want to, because I looked at the ethmoid bones in here, and there aren't really any ethmoid bones that show these ethmoid sinuses. A sinus is a hollow chamber inside the bone, and the ethmoid bone has many of these ethmoid sinuses. The job there is just to lighten the overall weight of these bones. We'll see the other things that these sinuses do is they're going to act as resonance chambers for speech. We're going to see the other sinuses here in just a second. Before I point out the other sinuses, we have to recognize 4 sutures. I think all 4 of these sutures made your lab list. And any of these skulls that have these sutures kind of outlined, it's easy to see these different sutural lines. So the first one that we have to recognize is this coronal suture. Let me go to, we'll go back to this picture. You can see the coronal suture is right here. It's between the frontal bone and those 2 parietal bones. So maybe on your lab list, just right next to the coronal suture, that this is between the frontal bone and the 2 parietal bones. If you were to wear a crown, I guess it would sit right across that coronal suture. The other one that we have to know is the sagittal suture. You can barely see a little bit of that sagittal suture, but like its name is telling us, it's going to make a sagittal cut down the skull. It's going to split this skull into a left and a right piece. So sagittal suture is in between these 2 parietal bones. Here is our sagittal suture. I could point to coronal suture, I could point to sagittal suture, but if we flip this skull around to the back side, let's find a picture of the back of the skull. Here's decent. So when we see this occipital bone on the back of the skull, we can see a suture between the parietal bones and this occipital bone. This suture between the parietal bones and occipital bone, this is our lambdoidal suture. And that leaves only one more suture, the squamosal suture, and that suture is between the temporal bone and the parietal bone. So there's our squamosal suture.
I have a question.
Yep.
The sutures are considered bones?
Sutures are going to be joints. They're going to be connections between the bones. We're going to see that this is a type of immovable joint.
Where was the
Squamosal suture, that's going to be along the edge of the temporal bone, where the temporal bone and the parietal bone meet. If we're thinking about lambdoidal suture, that's between the occipital bone and those two parietal bones. So here's the lambdoidal suture. There is a good example of the sagittal suture. And once again, an individual that has some of those wormian bones, so more than the standard 206 bones of the body. Okay, we made it through sutures. We made it through cranial bones. So now let's point out the facial bones. And I feel that we're just kind of going down the list somewhere. This is the skeletal tissues handout, so let's keep going. We got through question number 21, so we're about to make our way down to, well, a lot of these are actually going to be found on question 25 when we're doing a matching thing. Some of the matching stuff on question 25 are part cranial bones and it's part facial bones. So let's introduce these facial bones. All of them are on the lab list. So the mandible, this is the lower jaw. So here's our mandible bone. Your lower teeth are attached to this mandible. We have to recognize the maxilla. So this is the bone that holds in your upper teeth. So the purple bone here is the maxilla. The zygomatic bones are the cheekbones. We can think of these here as the blue bones are cheekbones or zygomatic bones. We need to be aware of those. We have to be aware of the nasal bones. These are the ones that are kind of the prettier purple color. I don't know, the more saturated purple color right there. If you touch the top, that bridge of your nose, those bones, those are the nasal bones. So the purple ones here. And then as we go away from the nasal bone, I want to try and make a distinction between the nasal bone and these lacrimal bones. The green bones that you see just to the medial sides of your orbits. So each eye socket, if we go to the medial side of that eye socket, we'll see that each one has that green bone called a lacrimal bone. I'm going to zoom around maybe back to here for a second. Because you can see this green lacrimal bone and how that's different from this nasal bone that makes up the bridge of the nose. And then in between you can see this maxilla that holds in those front teeth. So zygomatic bone, maxilla bone, nasal bone, and that is our lacrimal bone. You can always tell the lacrimal bone because you can see that little lacrimal groove. I mean, we can see a little groove there, but even on these skulls that don't have the suture lines painted on them, can you look inside that medial part of the eye socket and you can see that little groove? You see that little groove right there? It leads down into a hole. That's the lacrimal canal. The lacrimal bone and that lacrimal canal, that leads down into the nasal cavity. So if you've ever, like when your eyes tear up, those tears will drain through that lacrimal canal and end up in the nasal cavity. Anyway, just pointing out the difference between lacrimal bone and nasal bone. So let's catch back up. Nasal bones have been distinguished from those lacrimal bones. So now let's talk about the palatine bone. To see the palatine bone, like if you cleanse your palate, you're thinking of the bone that's along the roof of the mouth. So I'm going to need to go back a couple of slides to where, right here, to where we're looking at the underside of the skull. And this picture is showing the palatine bone in kind of a yellowish color. Most of the roof of the mouth is part of the maxilla bone, the same one that holds the top teeth. But if we get to the back of the roof of the mouth, kind of where the roof of the mouth and the entrance to the nasal cavity are found, this is where we find the palatine bone. I feel like we also saw it here in this picture, but instead of a yellow color, they're using just kind of a bone color to show this palatine bone. And those openings right there, those lead into the nasal cavity. That's why smell and taste are closely associated with one another through this palatine bone. So to show that, we would have to flip one of these skulls upside down. And this is one that doesn't have those suture lines. But if we did grab a skull, just grab this one, that's got well-defined suture lines, you should be able to tell where one bone stops and the next one begins to find the palatine bone that's there. Next one on the list, we've got the vomer and then these inferior nasal concha. The vomer is going to be this blue structure that we see coming up from the bottom of the nasal cavity. It makes its way up and it helps form this complete septum that separates either half of this nasal cavity. You'll notice that the top part of this nasal septum is in a different color. That's going to be part of the ethmoid bone. In particular, if you look at the ethmoid bone, there's a structure on it called the perpendicular plate. We're going to see the perpendicular plate of that ethmoid bone comes down, and it ends up merging with the ethmoid bone that's making its way up. And together they form that septum of the nasal cavity. Before I go away from this picture, you can see kind of coming off the walls of the nasal cavity, the inferior projection that comes off the walls of the nasal cavity. This is going to be our inferior nasal concha. And on any of these skulls, if you just look inside this nasal cavity, the bumps that come off the side of those nasal cavities are going to be the nasal concha. The lower bumps are the inferior nasal concha. The next ones that we see, these are the middle nasal concha, and there's even a third set, a superior nasal concha that we can't quite see from this picture. But you can easily see those inferior nasal concha. They're in a green color. The middle and superior nasal concha are part of the ethmoid bone, so you see them colored the same color as the ethmoid bone. Okay, I'm just going to grab that lab list real quick because I want to show you some things that I pointed out earlier, like the fact that one of the bones that we have to know on here is the occipital bone. Number 4, we have to see occipital bone. So we'll have to recognize, like on a station on a practical, I likely will either have the whole skull or maybe I'll just have that bone there. And typically the first question is, give me the name of this bone. And then the second question will be, name this specific structure on that bone. On the temporal bone, you know, I could just be saying, give me the name of this bone, and I could point to the mastoid process or the styloid process or the zygomatic process. If it's the occipital bone, we would have to know the occipital bone, but then maybe these occipital condyles. Again, condyles, any of these smooth spots on a bone that have to articulate with another bone. Or a foramen is a hole in a bone, and this is a big foramen. So this is the foramen magnum. I think those are the two things we needed to know on the occipital bone, and a few things there on the temporal bone, just to show you how to read that lab list and how I'm going to make stations on the practical out of it. I'll leave that over there. I'll keep going with this lab list. And some of the things that I was just trying to point out, we can see better from this side view. For example, this ethmoid bone is the bone that is in green, and maybe I can zoom in on that a little bit. We've zoomed in on it a little bit. The ethmoid bone is still in a green color, and what you can see now that we can see all of the ethmoid bone, you can see that middle nasal concha and the superior nasal concha. Those are both part of the ethmoid bone. We can see that cribiform, let me try that again. Here's that cribiform plate that has holes punched in it. This is that fin called the cristogalli that sticks up. You can also see sinuses in the frontal bone. I don't think we've pointed out the sinuses just yet. But we can see two sinuses on this picture, the frontal sinus hollow chamber in the frontal bone, and then there's this hollow chamber in the sphenoid bone, our sphenoid sinuses. And I also like this picture. It shows that sella turcica, this little depression that's part of the sphenoid bone. It's noteworthy because we're going to see later the pituitary gland sits right there in that sella turcica. These are the same thing. This is the ethmoid bone that's in kind of a golden color. And then this bottom picture down here is the inferior nasal concha. This is a middle nasal concha and superior nasal concha. That nasal septum has been removed from this picture, but here we've put the nasal septum back. So the nasal septum, that wall, like when I was holding the skull directly up, and you can see there's a dividing wall that separates that nasal cavity into a left and right piece. This is that wall that separates it into a left and right half. So the bottom part of that wall is this vomer bone. The top part of that wall is the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone. And then everything in here that completes that septum, this is all hyaline cartilage. You can grab that hyaline cartilage right now. And we can also see, again, the sinuses in the frontal bone and then the sinuses in the sphenoid bone. There is a spot on the lecture handout. This looks like it's going to be question number 23 when we're thinking of the 7 bones that make up the orbit. We're jumping around, but we'll get to all of these things at some point. So number 23, the 7 bones that make up the orbit. We can see them all right here, even though they're not labeled. And this might, a real life scenario of how this might come into play is there was somebody at one of those Round Rock Express baseball games not too many years ago. I mean, this happens in baseball sometimes, where like somebody will pull the ball and hit somebody right in the head and break several bones in the orbit. Somebody got messed up not too long ago because of that. But you also see this in people that have car accidents where their head hits the steering wheel, and or the dashboard or something like that. You can end up with these broken bones in the orbit. So we're going to list the 7 bones that are found here in the orbit, and I'm just going to go we'll just go in a counterclockwise direction. I'll start here at the top. The first one that we can see here is the frontal bone. Let's maybe do this as a practice. Here's our frontal bone. What did we call this blue bone? Cheekbone? Zygomatic bone. So that one's on the list. Then we've got this bone that holds in the top teeth. That's our maxilla bone. So frontal bone, zygomatic bone, and maxilla bone. We would also include this green bone that's got the groove right there. It's our lacrimal bone. So we've got 4 on the list so far. It's an orange color. It might not be obvious what we're looking at here, but that little bit of this bone, this is the side wall of the ethmoid bone. So just behind the lacrimal bone, we can see a little bit of that ethmoid bone. So if we're counting, we've got frontal bone, zygomatic bone, maxilla, zygomatic, ethmoid bone, and then the one in the back of the eye socket, this is part of the sphenoid bone. So that's 6, and we've got only one more that is a bone that's part of the eye socket, and it is not the nasal bone. Instead, it's that little bit of a bone that sticks out right there that forms the completion of the back of the eye socket. That is a orbital process of the palatine bone. Let me just go over here. Orbital process of the palatine bone. That might not be obvious, so I wanted to go to this labeled slide. That's the 7th bone that makes up the orbit. So make sure you have frontal bone, zygomatic bone, maxilla, lacrimal bone, ethmoid bone, sphenoid bone, and then the last one there is the palatine bone. And it's not the entire palatine bone, it's just that orbital process of the palatine bone. Quickly to question number 24. I knew we would get there at some point. Here are the 4 bones of the skull that have sinuses associated with them. We had been seeing the frontal sinus. That frontal bone has hollow pockets in it. we had been seeing that within the sphenoid bone, there is also that sphenoid sinuses. I'll go back a couple of pictures to show the sphenoid sinus. And then again, there's the frontal sinus. There are also ethmoid sinuses. Again, I said to cross that off the lab list because we don't have a model that shows those air pockets inside the ethmoid bone. And I'll have to look close. I don't know that we even have a skull model that has parts of the maxilla that come off that show just underneath the maxilla there are these hollow chambers called the maxillary sinuses. So just underneath your maxilla bone here, you have these hollow maxillary sinuses. So 4 bones of the skull that have sinuses. The maxilla is one of those. The sphenoid bone would be another one. The ethmoid bone and the frontal bone are the 4 bones that have sinuses. Here it is from the side view. You can see the ethmoid bone that has all of those air pockets in it. All of these air pockets, what all of those sinuses have in common is really 2 functions. The first function is that they act to lighten the overall weight of the skull. Bones are heavy. So where we can replace those bones with hollow pockets, it makes the skull lighter. But the other thing those sinuses do is that they act as resonance chambers for speech. That means when you're, like, maybe another way is if you've ever been like sitting on a couch eating chips or something like that, the crunchy chips, like if I'm sitting there and I'm crunching down on these chips, in my head, it sounds loud. I'm crunching on these chips because I can hear the sound bouncing through all these sinuses. But the person sitting next to me, they could probably hear me chewing on these chips, but it's not as loud to them because they don't hear the reverberations. Another example is like when you're talking to somebody, you hear your own reverberations. But if you hear yourself recorded, you're like, oh, that doesn't sound like I'm used to hearing myself sound, because you're used to hearing the reverberations. It took me a while to get used to my recorded voice because it doesn't sound how I'm hearing my voice, because I can hear those reverberations. If you ever had to build speakers in boxes, these like ported boxes or things like that that can get air moving, not that we have to get into speaker design, but it's kind of the same concept, that you've got these hollow chambers that allow the sound waves to bounce around and amplify the sound. I'll mention these real quick. I don't know that this is on here, but then we're going to go back and answer number 22 that I keep dancing around. But when we're thinking about these bones of the skull, some other bones to mention are these inner ear bones. I'm trying to find an ear model. Here are a couple. When we look at the ear models, we're going to see that there are a series of delicate bones, these 3 ear bones collectively called the malleus, the incus, and the stapes, that we will see at the end of the semester. Those are the ones that catch sound waves from the environment and then amplify those sound waves and stimulate a sensory neuron that is right here on the model that perceives those waves as sound. Anyway, malleus, incus, and stapes, those are going to be ear bones that we will elaborate on later. Then finally, number 22 is the hyoid bone. This is another one of those sesamoid bones, this freely floating bone. It doesn't articulate with any other bone in the body. Instead, this hyoid bone, because it doesn't articulate with any other bone in the body, but it provides the tongue with a place. Here's what it does. It serves those tongue muscles. It gives them a place to attach to. So I said last time, if you want to feel this hyoid bone, just put your hand on the anterior part of your throat and move your tongue around. And that bone that you're using to kind of help move your tongue around is that hyoid bone. So now, even though we've kind of danced around, we've answered number 21, 22, 23, and 24. Now to 25. There's just a bunch of... I bet we've already answered all of those things on 25 by describing those cranial bones or those facial bones. So I won't go directly through that. Instead, I'm going to jump over quickly to number 26, and I want to introduce the different parts to this vertebral column. We'll break free and do lab here in a second, and if you want to break into groups and go through any of the questions on 25, we can tackle those as a team. But I just want to try within the next 30 minutes to get through this vertebral column introduction. Here's the entire vertebral column. It's going to include the vertebrae of the neck, the vertebrae of the thoracic region, the vertebrae of the lumbar region, as well as this sacrum and coccyx down here. Here's what I'm referring to. The first 7 vertebrae we're going to call the cervical vertebrae, the neck vertebrae. The next 12 vertebrae are going to be the thoracic vertebrae. And then the last 5 vertebrae are the lumbar vertebrae. Past that, you have a series of fused vertebrae. There are 5 vertebrae that have fused together into one structure. This one structure is called the sacrum. I think I held one of those up earlier. This is the sacrum. It's just one bone, but it's basically derived from the fusion of 5 individual vertebrae. It's now fused to just one bone, so we call it the sacrum. And then attached to the sacrum is the coccyx, which is 3 to 4 fused vertebrae. I'm looking over here on this one because some of these models do a decent job. Here's one. This one shows that coccyx, how it's not the same as the sacrum. So they have a little bit of a wire here separating this coccyx from the sacrum. So coccyx, sacrum, and then all of those vertebrae that make up the vertebral column.
That's your tailbone, the coccyx?
The coccyx or the tailbone, that's right. So the vertebral column is all of those sections: cervical vertebrae, thoracic vertebrae, lumbar vertebrae, sacrum, and coccyx. One way that people can remember this, and you may have heard this before or not, it doesn't work. I think now that we're, I don't know, living in the year that we live in now, everybody has different schedules. But a traditional way of describing these vertebrae, somebody said, and again, this might not be helpful at all, but if you think of a typical time when you would eat breakfast, a typical time you would eat breakfast is around 7 o'clock in the morning. Again, who actually eats breakfast at 7? I don't know. But just think, if you eat breakfast around 7 o'clock in the morning and then lunch around noon and then dinner around 5 o'clock, those are sometimes easy to remember in terms of the hours. That might be one way that you can remember that there are 7 cervical vertebrae, there are 12 thoracic vertebrae, and 5 lumbar vertebrae. Maybe that's not helpful at all. There are other ways to remember it. One of the ways I remember the thoracic vertebrae is that there's something unique about thoracic vertebrae. Every one of those thoracic vertebrae are going to have a rib attached to them. You've got 12 pairs of ribs and you've got 12 thoracic vertebrae. So when we look close to those thoracic vertebrae, each one is going to have, can you see it right there? It's a little oval, like a little white oval. That's called a costal facet. It's a place where a rib attaches. And you can see that vertebrae right there has a costal facet. That's a thoracic vertebrae. A rib would attach right there. But notice how the next vertebrae doesn't have that costal facet. This is a lumbar vertebrae. It's not going to have a rib that attaches to it. Other things like lumbar vertebrae have to support a lot more weight than cervical vertebrae do. So you can see the cervical vertebrae have smaller bodies, and the body size increases as we go down this vertebral column. So it's easy to recognize lumbar vertebrae from thoracic or cervical vertebrae. Each kind of have their own unique structures to remember. So I'll try and point out a few of them as we go through this vertebral column. I thought that was a question, but stop me if there's anything that I don't see if you have your hand up. I'm going to start at the very top of the cervical vertebrae. There's only 7 cervical vertebrae, and the first 2 get a special name. They have special modifications to them. The very first cervical vertebrae is called the atlas. What's unique about the atlas is it's the only vertebrae that doesn't have a body. Instead, what you see is this little ring. It's a ligament that is going to help hold this atlas on top of the second vertebrae called the axis. Maybe you can think alphabetical order. The AT would come before the AX. So atlas comes before axis. Maybe you can also remember axis because the axis has this pivot point. It has a little projection on the body of this vertebrae. The projection is called the dens. And it's that dens you can see that the atlas kind of wraps around and uses that dens as a pivot point. In fact, when you look at somebody and you shake your head no, what you're basically doing is you're just rotating this atlas on top of the axis and you're shaking your head no. Remember those occipital condyles? We were looking at, I'm going to go back a few pictures here. Well, when we were talking about these occipital condyles right there, those sit right on top of the atlas right here. So they sit in these little condyles of the atlas. And if you're shaking your head yes to somebody, then your occipital condyles are basically rocking back and forth along these condyles. So the first cervical vertebrae is the atlas. It does not have a body. The second cervical vertebrae is called the axis. It does have a body, and unique, it has a little projection that sticks off the top of that body that we call the dens. So all cervical vertebrae, let me do it this way. Here's a typical cervical vertebrae. All cervical vertebrae have these additional foramen on the sides of the body. So if we go on either side of the body of the cervical vertebrae, we can see these transverse foramen. All cervical vertebrae have that. So even these specific cervical vertebrae, the first and second cervical vertebrae, the atlas and axis, they too have those transverse foramen. So I'm trying to give you something that is unique to all cervical vertebrae. All cervical vertebrae are going to have those transverse foramen, just like this. And what they do, they serve as a place for blood vessels to run through. And I'm going to go back to this spinal cord model that we have. If you look at the spinal cord model, when you get up into the neck vertebrae, you'll see these vertebral arteries. And we'll learn later that they supply the brain with 20% of its blood. The other 80% comes through the internal carotids. But these vertebral arteries, they make their way up through those transverse foramen. And you'll see those transverse foramen go away as soon as we hit the thoracic vertebrae. So when I'm thinking cervical vertebrae, the noteworthy things, you know, since it's way up there in the neck, it's not supporting a lot of the weight of the body. So we see a relatively small body compared to the thoracic and lumbar vertebrae. We see these additional transverse foramen in these transverse processes. There is a vertebral foramen, that's where the spinal cord would go. And kind of sticking off the back of the spine, you have what's called the spinoous process. So if I flip this skeleton around, you can kind of feel this ridge of spinoous processes that stick off the back of this vertebral column. So you'll notice that the spinoous processes in the cervical vertebrae are somewhat blunted. They're not as much of a projection as they are in this thoracic region. The other clue in the cervical vertebrae, that spinoous process is kind of forked. Look at how when we go from the cervical vertebrae down into the thoracic vertebrae, the body takes on more of a rounded appearance. It's supporting more weight, so we've got a larger body. Not only is the body more rounded, you can see that vertebral foramen is much more of a rounded appearance. Before, it was kind of a triangular shaped appearance, and now it becomes more of a rounded appearance. We can see the spinoous process. It's no longer forked. You can see these transverse processes, and neither of those transverse processes have a transverse foramen in it. We just see that transverse process. Previously, those transverse foramen had processes running through them. Okay, so this is the thoracic vertebrae. Maybe the other giveaway is that you can see those costal facets, places where a rib is going to attach. So any thoracic vertebrae will have a rib attached to it. Lumbar vertebrae, as we go further down this vertebral column, the body is larger, it supports more weight. You can see the spinoous process once again becomes kind of blunted like it was in the cervical region. You once again see transverse processes, but there is no transverse foramen. The other noteworthy thing that you see here in the lumbar vertebrae are these articular processes that stick out between the spinous process and the transverse process. Those articular processes, they cause these lumbar vertebrae to lock together. Let me demonstrate, going back over to this spinal column here. The thoracic vertebrae, here's what those thoracic vertebrae look like. There are none of those articular processes in there. So if I want to twist these thoracic vertebrae next to one another, there's a little bit of a twisting there. So like if you're rotating or twisting anything like this, those are the thoracic vertebrae that are twisting back and forth. And what's not twisting back and forth when I do this, my lumbar vertebrae are all locked together. If you come down here and grab the lumbar vertebrae and try and twist them, you'll see what's preventing that twisting is the bumping together of those articular processes. They lock them together. Okay, so when we see articular processes in a large body, that's a clue that we're looking at a lumbar vertebrae. You'll also notice how that vertebral foramen kind of goes back to a triangular shape like it was in the cervical vertebrae. Kind of becomes rounded in the thoracic region, then it goes back to kind of triangular shaped in the lumbar region. But you wouldn't confuse this for cervical vertebrae because of the large body and the lack of the transverse foramen and the presence of the articular processes. Okay, I only have one more thing to put on the board, and it's a pretty simple thing. I'm going to have to erase one of these. Is it okay if I erase this long bone sketch? Everybody good with that? I just want to talk about curvatures of the spine, normal and abnormal curvatures of the spine. I can click through some of these while I'm erasing. You can see in this slide, we can see abnormal lateral curvatures of the spine. So if there is an abnormal lateral curvature of the spine, we call this type of curvature scoliosis. It can occur in the thoracic region or in the lumbar region, but any kind of abnormal lateral curvature is scoliosis. We can compare that to an abnormal curvature of the thoracic part of the spine. If it's an abnormal curvature of the thoracic part of the spine, this is kyphosis, or kind of like that hunchback kind of syndrome. I see this in the nursing home a lot of times too. So kyphosis is an abnormal curvature of the thoracic portion of the vertebral column. And then lordosis is an abnormal, kind of an exaggerated curvature of the lumbar region of the spine. Maybe, like if you've seen somebody that's like 8.5 months pregnant or something like that, that can lead to this lordosis, or an exaggerated curvature of the lateral, of the lumbar part of the spine. But before I get to the ribs real quick to talk about what's a true and a false rib, let me just talk about curvatures of the spine real quick. And I'll just go to this picture because we can see, I'll just go to this one because we can see even bigger. This is the normal curvature of an adult spine. But if you've ever held a newborn baby, you'll know that's not the type of curvature that is originally found in the spine. I'll lose it if I said it there. So let me draw the normal and abnormal curvatures of the spine and see if you can tell me what's going on there. That'll work. So in, well, like we can just see, the adult spine has a curvature that looks something like this, where there's a little bit of a curvature this way in the thoracic. Let me try that again. There's a curvature in this direction of the cervical vertebrae, and then the thoracic vertebrae kind of starts to curve in this direction. The lumbar vertebrae start to curve back in the opposite direction, and then the sacrum, this last region, starts to curve back in this direction. So I could have exaggerated that a little bit more, but we kind of have this little bit of a squiggly line in an adult spine versus a newborn. If you've held a newborn baby fresh out of the womb, they have a curvature of the spine that is pretty much just like this in one direction. This is what's referred to as primary curvature. Primary curvature of the spine. The reason it's considered primary curvature is because it is there, well, I'll just say it's there from birth. And what puts this primary curvature in the spine is because the baby has developed inside the womb. So in the womb, you have a original primary curvature of the spine that is like this. But as you go from a newborn to an adult, you see these changes in the way that this spine is curved. So notice if this is kind of a weak C shape. And notice how the C shape is kind of opened in this direction. We're going to go away. If this is the primary curvature, you can still see a little bit of that primary curvature in this region. And just to kind of label where we are, this part of the spine is representing the cervical region. So the cervical spine is right there. The thoracic part of the spine is right here. The lumbar part, once again, is right there. And then the sacral part, right back down there. And in the newborn, the cervical, the thoracic, the lumbar, and the sacral, they're all curving in the same direction due to that time inside the womb. But once you get out of the womb and you start to adapt to the real world, you start to develop these different curvatures in the thoracic and lumbar part. Notice how I think I just misspoke. Maybe I didn't, I don't know. You develop these different curvatures in the cervical and the lumbar part of the spine. Notice how the thoracic and sacral regions are still kind of curved like this original C shape opened in this direction. I'm going to label this primary curvature of the spine. We still see this primary curvature in the thoracic region, and you still see this primary curvature in the sacral region, and that was there from birth. So time in the womb. Time in the womb, that's where the primary curvature came from. So here's my question. What is it going on in a newborn baby's life that might cause them to develop these curvatures in the opposite direction? You'll see how the C shape in the cervical region and in the lumbar region it's kind of going in the opposite direction. So this is what we call a secondary curvature of the spine. And also the lumbar region has developed a secondary curvature. Secondary curvature, it's the opposite direction from primary curvature. So my question is, what's going on that causes the secondary curvature in the cervical vertebrae? Specifically lifting their head to try and look to see what's going around. So as they start to develop the muscles in the neck and lift that head around, just using the neck muscles is what develops this secondary curvature in the neck. So that develops as they start to look around. And then once they look around and start thinking, maybe I want to get over there, they figure out how to get up off the 4 limbs and walk around on 2 legs. And once they develop that balance and walking around on 2 legs, that's really what starts to develop this secondary curvature in the lumbar vertebrae. So something had to cause these curvatures to go away from primary curvature, and we just answered that. So the secondary curvature in the cervical vertebrae come from looking around, using that neck. And the secondary curvature in the lumbar vertebrae come from when they start walking around on 2 legs instead of just crawling. So looking and walking are things that allowed this vertebral column to develop these secondary curvatures that we see in the lumbar region and that secondary curvature in the cervical region. All right, so with 10 minutes left, I think I can get the last bit of this out, which I think is the last things, number 27 on your list. Well, it's not the last thing on the list, but it's the last thing we'll cover today. And that is the difference between true ribs, false ribs, and floating ribs. And I always thought there was a better way to describe that, because a true rib, you know, a false rib isn't a rib that's just telling lies. So let's give that a good anatomical definition. A better word for true ribs is what we're going to call vertebrosternal ribs. So vertebrosternal, this is a term that describes true ribs. This would be ribs 1 through 7. The first 7 pair of ribs are true ribs, or maybe more correctly described as these vertebrosternal ribs. That means part of this rib comes attached to the vertebral column, and the other part of that rib is going to attach to the sternum itself. We've obviously got a big one there on the screen, but I always like to come over here to this skeleton that's hanging, and we can see there's the sternum. You should be able to count 7 ribs that will attach directly to that sternum. And I'll grab my pointer and we'll just do this on the picture. We can see there's one rib that has its cartilage that touches the sternum all by itself. So 1 rib, there's 2, 3, 4, and then notice we've got 5, 6, 7 more pieces of cartilage that touch this sternum all by itself. And if we follow those pieces of cartilage out, there's a rib. That would be the 6th rib. And then following this one out, that would be the 7th rib right there. Those are all the vertebrosternal ribs. They touch the sternum. They touch the vertebral column around back. Notice beneath that there is rib 8, 9, and 10 that have this costal cartilage that instead of attaching to the sternum, this costal cartilage just attaches to the cartilage of the rib above. So rib 8, 9, and 10 are going to be called vertebrochondral ribs because part of them attach to this vertebrae, but the anterior connection is a cartilage connection. So false ribs we can more correctly call vertebrochondral ribs. Again, vertebrae, and then chondral tells us cartilage. These are false ribs. That's going to be ribs 8 through 10. There's still one more category to go, what are sometimes just referred to as floating ribs. They don't have any cartilage whatsoever, so there's no anterior connection. There's only that posterior connection to the vertebral column. So these are just called vertebral ribs. Indirectly called floating ribs, like we said, and this would be ribs 11 and 12. Just vertebral ribs. Okay, and that is the last slide, so I've still left us with an hour, and I feel good about that. That we got most of the way through our skeletal system introduction. So that means on Tuesday we'll finish the appendicular skeleton, which there are bones and a lot of bone processes on the appendicular skeleton, and then we'll talk about joints and body movements. I bet I can finish all of that in under 2 hours easily next time. I took 3 hours of your lecture time today, so there will be much more time, I guess, next meeting to focus on lab stuff. But with the hour that we have left in here, or a little over an hour, whatever it is, I'll switch into lab mode. I'll come around and help you answer or find any of these bone surface markings on the axial skeleton. If you want to look at skin models again, I'll be glad to go back to skin models.